Part 2 of 2. And then as she studied the distant horseman, a puzzled expression came over her face.
"Why, Kitty," she said in a low tone, so the men who were talking did not hear. Do you know, that man sort of reminds me."
She hesitated and lowered the glasses to look at her companion with half amused, half embarrassed eyes.
"He reminds me of Lawrence Knight."
Kitty's brown, fun-loving eyes glowed with mischief.
"Really, Miss Manning, I'm ashamed of you. Before the honeymoon has waned your thoughts with no better excuse than the appearance of a poor cowpuncher. Go back to the captivating dreams of your old millionaire lover. Kitty, hush!" pleaded Helen.
She lifted her glasses for another look at the cowboy.
"I don't wonder why your conscience repudiates you," teased Kitty in a low tone. "But tell me, poor child, how did it happen that you lost your millionaire?" "I didn't lose him," retorted Helen, still watching Patches. "He lost me."
Kitty persisted with playful mockery.
"What? The great, wonderful knight of so many millions failed, with all of his glittering charm, to captivate the fair but simple Helen? Really, I can't believe that." "Look at that man right there," flashed Helen proudly, indicating her husband, "and you can believe it."
Kitty laughed so gaily that Stanford turned to look at them with smiling inquiry.
"Oh, never mind, Mr. Manning," said Kitty. "We're just reminiscing, that's all."
"Well, don't be missing the race," he answered. "They're getting ready to start. Looks like it's a go this time."
"And to think," muttered Kitty, "that I never so much as saw your knight's picture. But you used to like Lawrence Knight, didn't you, Helen?"
she added, as Helen lifted her field glasses again, and now Miss Manning caught a note of earnest inquiry in her companion's voice. It was as though the girl was seeking conferment of some purpose or decision of her own.
"Why, yes, Kitty, I liked Larry Knight very much," she answered frankly. "He was a fine fellow in many ways, a dear good friend. Stanford and I are both very fond of him. They were college mates, you know. But, my dear girl, no one could ever consider poor Larry seriously. As a man, you know, he was so utterly and hopelessly worthless." "Worthless? With how many millions is it?" "Oh, Kitty, you know what I mean, but really, dear, we've talked enough about Mr. Lawrence Knight. I'm going to have another look at that cowboy. He looks like a real man, doesn't he? What is it the dean calls him?" "Patches." "Oh, yes, what a funny name, Patches. Honorable Patches," said Kitty. "How odd," she mused. "Stan, come here a minute. Take the glasses and look at that cowboy down there."
Stanford trained the field glasses as she directed.
"Doesn't he remind you of Larry Knight?"
"Larry Knight?" Stanford looked at her in amazement. "That cowpuncher, Larry Knight? I should say not, Lord, but wouldn't cultured and correct old Larry feel complimented to know you found him anything in common with that cowpuncher you remind you of? But here, take your glasses, quick. They're going to start it finally."
Even as Helen looked, Judge Morris gave the signal, and the first racing car, with a mighty roar, leapt away from the starting point and thundered up the street between the lining of the crowds and cheering people. An instant more, and Helen Manning witnessed a scene that thrilled the hearts of every man, woman, and child in that great crowd. In the big racing car, gathering speed at every throb of the powerful motor, swept towards the hill a small boy, but no more than a toddler baby, escaped from his mother, who, with the exciting throng, was crowded against the rope barrier, and before those eyes were fixed on the automobiles noticed, the child was in the street, fairly in the path of the approaching machine. A sudden hush fell on the shouting multitude. Helen, through the field glasses, could even see the child's face as, laughing gleefully, he looked back when his mother screamed. Stricken with horror, the young woman could not lower her glasses. Fascinated, she watched. The people seemed for an instant paralyzed. Not a soul moved or uttered a sound. Would the driver of the racing car swerve aside of his course in time? If he did, would the baby in sudden fright dodge in front of another machine? Then Helen saw the cowboy who had so interested her lean forward in his saddle, strike his spurs deep in the flanks of his already restless horse. With a sudden bound, the animal cleared the rope barrier and in an instant was leaping towards a child in the approaching car. The people gasped at the daring of the man who had not waited to think. It was over in a second, and as Patches swept by the child, he leaned low from the saddle, and in the next leap of his horse carried him barely clear of the machine. They saw his tall, lithe body straighten, and as he swung the baby up into his arms. Then, indeed, the crowd went wild. Men yelled and cheered, women laughed and cried, as the cowboy returned the frightened baby to the distressed mother. 100 eager hands were stretching forth to greet him. But the excited horse backed away. Somebody raised the rope barrier and Patches disappeared down the side street. Helen's eyes were wet, but she was smiling.
"No," she said softly to Kitty and Stanford. "That was not Lawrence Knight. Poor old Larry could never have done that."
It was little after the noon hour when Kitty, who, with her father, mother, and brothers, had been for dinner at the home of one of their Prescott friends, had crossed the plaza on her way to join Mr. and Mrs. Manning, with whom she was spending the afternoon. In a less frequented corner of the little park, back of the courthouse, she saw Patches. The cowboy, who had changed from his ranch costume to a less picturesque business garb, was seated alone on one of the benches that was placed along the walks, reading a letter. With his attention fixed upon the letter, he did not notice Kitty as she approached, and the girl, when she first caught sight of him, paused for an instant. Then she went towards him slowly, studying him with new interest. She was quite near when, looking up, he saw her. In an instant he rose to his feet and slipped the letter into his pocket and stood before her, hat in hand, to greet her with genuine pleasure and with that gentle courtesy that always marked his bearing. And Kitty, as she looked up at him, felt, more convincingly than ever, that this man would be perfectly at ease in the most exact social company.
"I fear I'm interrupting you," said the young woman. "I was just passing."
"Oh, not at all," he protested. "Surely you can give me a moment of your busy gala day. I know you have a host of friends, of course, but, well, I am lonely. Curly and Bob and the boys are all having the time of their lives, and the dean and mother are lunching with friends. I don't know where Phil has hidden himself." It was like him to mention Phil in almost his first words to her, and Kitty, as Patches spoke Phil's name instantly, as she had so often done these past few months, mentally placed the men two side by side.
"I just wanted to tell you," she hesitated. "Mr. Patches."
"I beg your pardon," he interrupted, smiling.
"Well, Patches, then, but you seem so different somehow, dressed like this. I just wanted to tell you that what I saw happen this morning, it was splendid."
"Why, Miss Reed, you know that was nothing. The driver of the car would have probably dodged the youngster anyway. I was just acting on impulse on the moment without thinking. I'm always doing something unnecessarily foolish, you know."
"The driver of the car most likely would have dodged into the child," she returned warmly. "And it was fortunate that someone in all that stupid crowd could act without taking time to think. Everybody says so. The dear old dean is pleased and proud, as though you were one of his own sons."
"Oh, really, you're making too much of it," he returned, clearly embarrassed by her praise. "Tell me, are you enjoying the celebration, and what's the matter with Phil? Can't you persuade him to ride in the contest? We don't want the championship to go out of Yokpai County, do we?" Why must he always bring Phil into their talk? Kitty asked herself.
I'm sure that Phil knows how his friends feel about his riding, she said coolly. If he doesn't wish to gratify them, it's really a small matter, isn't it?
Patches saw that he made a mistake and changed easily to a safer topic. You saw the beginning of the automobile race, of course. I suppose you will be on hand this afternoon for the finish?
Oh, yes. I'm on my way now to join my friends, Mr. and Mrs. Stanford Manning. We're going to see the finish of the race together.
She watched his face closely as she spoke of her friends, but he gave no sign that he'd ever heard the name before. It'll be worth seeing, I fancy, he returned. At least everybody seems to feel that way.
I'm sure to have a good time, anyway. Because, you see, Miss Manning is one of my dearest girlfriends, whom I have not seen for a long time.
Indeed, you will enjoy the afternoon, then. Was there a shade of too much enthusiasm in the tone of his reply? Kitty wondered. Could it be that his plea of loneliness had been merely a convenient courtesy, and that he was really relieved to find that she was engaged for the afternoon?
Yes, and I must hurry on to them, or they will think I'm not coming. Have a good time, Patches. You've surely earned it. Goodbye.
He stood for a moment, watching her cross the park, and then with a quick look around as though he did not wish to be observed, he hurried across the street to the Western Union office. A few moments later, he made his way by little frequent side streets to the stable where he had left his horse. And while Kitty and her friends were watching the first of the racing cars cross the line, Patches was several miles away, riding as though pursued by the sheriff straight for the Cross Triangle Ranch. Several times that day, while she was with her eastern friends, Kitty saw Phil nearby, but she gave him no signal to join them, and the cowboy, shy as always, and hurt by Kitty's indifference, would not approach the little party without her invitation. But that evening, while Kitty was waiting in the hotel lobby for Mr. and Mrs. Manning, Phil, finding her alone, went to her. I've been trying to speak to you all day, he said reproachfully. Haven't you any time at all for me, Kitty?
Don't be foolish, Phil, she returned. You've seen me a dozen times.
I have seen you, yes.
But, Phil, you could have come to me if you wanted to.
I have no desire to go where I'm not wanted, he answered.
Phil!
Well, you gave no sign that you wanted me to.
Well, there's no reason why I should, she retorted. You're not a child. I was with my friends from the East. You could have joined us if you had cared to. I should be very glad indeed to present you to Mr. and Mrs. Manning.
Thank you, but I don't care to be exhibited as an interesting specimen to people who have no use for me except when I do some fool stunts to amuse them.
Very well, Phil, she returned coldly. If that's your feeling, I do not care to present you to my friends. They are every bit as sincere and genuine as you are, and I certainly shall not trouble them with anyone who cannot appreciate them.
Kitty was angry, as she had good reason for being, but beneath her anger she was sorry for the man whose bitterness she knew was born of his love for her. And Phil saw only that Kitty was lost to him, saw in the girl's eastern friends those who, he felt, had robbed him of his dream. I suppose, he said, after a moment's painful silence, that I'd better go back to the range where I belong. I'm out of place here. The girl was touched by the hopelessness in his voice, but felt it would be no kindness to offer him the relief of an encouraging word. Her day with her eastern friends and the memories that her meeting with Miss Manning had aroused convinced her more than ever that her old love for Phil and the life of which he was part were for her impossible. When she did not speak, the cowboy said bitterly, I notice that your fine friends do not take quite all your time. You found an opportunity for a quiet little visit with Honorable Patches. Kitty was angry now in earnest.
You are forgetting yourself, Phil, she answered with cold dignity. And I think that as long as you feel as you do towards my friends, and can speak to me like this about Mr. Patches, you are right to say that you belong on the range. Mr. and Mrs. Manning are here, I see. I'm going to be dining with them. Goodbye.
She turned away, leaving him standing there. A moment he waited, as though stunned, and then he turned to make his way blindly out of the hotel. It was nearly morning when Patches was awakened by the sound of someone moving about the kitchen. A moment he listened, then rising, went quickly to the kitchen door, thinking to surprise some chance night visitor. When Phil saw him, standing there, the foreman for a moment said nothing, but, with a bread knife in one hand and one of Stella's good loaves in the other, stared at him in blank surprise. Then the look of surprise changed to an expression of questioning suspicion, and he demanded harshly, "What the hell are you doing here?" Patches saw that the man was laboring under some great trouble. Indeed, Phil's voice and manner were not unlike one under the influence of strong drink. But Patches knew that Phil never drank. "I was sleeping," he answered calmly. "You woke me up, I suppose. I heard you and came to see who was prowling around the kitchen at this time of night, that's all." "Oh, that's all, is it? But what are you here for? Why aren't you in Prescott where you're supposed to be?" Patches, because he saw Phil's painful state of mind, exercised admirable self-control. "I supposed I had perfect right to come here if I wished. I did not dream that my presence in this house would be questioned." "That depends," Phil retorted. "Why'd you leave Prescott?" Patches, still calm, answered gently, "My reasons for not staying in Prescott are entirely personal, Phil. I don't care to explain it just now." "Oh, you don't? Well, it seems to me, sir, that you have a devil of a lot of personal business that you can't seem to explain." "I'm afraid I have," returned Patches with his old self-mocking smile. "But look here, Phil. You are disturbed and all wrought up about something, or you wouldn't attack me like this. You don't really think me a suspicious character, and you know you don't. You're not yourself, old man. And I'll be hanged if I take anything you say as an insult, until I know that you say it deliberately in cold blood. I'm sorry for your trouble, Phil. Damn sorry. I'd give anything if I could help you. Perhaps I may be able to prove the latter, but just now I think the kindest and wisest thing I can do for both of us is just say goodnight." He turned at the last word, without waiting for Phil to speak, and went back to his room. End of chapter 12.